Welcome back to On Texas Football. I'm CJ Vogel, joined by Jeff Howe for this week's edition of State of the Program. Of course, this week's State of the Program, all of everything going on at SEC Media Days, brought to you by Vaughn Lane, Flat Creek Estate Winery, Advanced Pain Care, and South Point Dodge. This episode of State of the Program brought to you especially by our friend Adam Lowy and the Lowy Law Firm. But a lot has changed over the last 48 hours, Jeff, since we first arrived in Atlanta in terms of recruiting on the trail, momentum for the Texas Longhorns on the recruiting trail, and then, of course, what Steve Sarkisian and Michael Taft, Anthony Hill, and, a guy named Arch Manning had to say yesterday while they spoke to all sorts of media here in Atlanta. But, Jeff, I wanted to start a little bit with what we heard from Arch Manning and Steve Sarkisian. We won't go too in-depth with it. Obviously, we've talked about it plenty, because I do want to get to where things go from here on the recruiting trail with two commitments on Tuesday for the Texas Longhorns. But I did want to get your thoughts on what Steve Sarkisian said. You got to hear from him a couple times, but look, this feels to me like a guy that's very comfortable with this team. He mentioned that he liked his roster quite a bit, but you still got to get over the hump in terms of where this team is, where Georgia is getting into that SEC championship, and, of course, a potential run at the national championship.
Yeah, I think Sark has talked about this. He talked about a lot on the Third and Longhorn podcast that when he got the job, and I think, CJ, if you really ask Sark, honestly, I think it's probably the midpoint of that first season when things really started to go off the rails. And I think he found out real quick which guys were bought in and which guys weren't. And I think at that point he realized, the culture doesn't need to be tweaked. It needs to be completely just torn down to the studs and rebuilt. And I say that to say complacency and entitlement were two things that he talked about. I don't think those two words describe where Texas is at all right now. The vibe you get in, it's funny, like Arch and Michael Taft and Anthony Hill, they all kind of echo what Sark says. And the bottom line is this is a program, CJ, this is a team that's hungry right now. Like, they've tasted how close they've been to playing for a national championship the last 2 years. And, they understand. They know they've got to scale that mountain and slay the dragon that is Georgia. They know they've got to continue to take care of their business against Oklahoma and continue to take care of their business against Texas A&M. Otherwise, none of it matters. So I just think the focus on staying hungry, keeping your eyes on the prize, taking it one day at a time. It sounds cliche. It sounds coach speak. But that's really, truly how this team operates. That's the one thing that I took away from Sark more than anything, is that even with all the positive things going on, the culture's in a place where everybody's still hungry and still focused on that big prize.
Now, I know a lot of folks outside of Austin, Texas, outside of the Texas fan base will sit there and say, well, you start the day with a big commitment of Tyler Atkinson. You end the day with a big flip of James Johnson. Well, that's NIL, right? That's Texas going out there and spending the money to build the class. And while that is a part of it, look, I think Sarkisian hit the nail on the head when he was saying, look, I took over a team that didn't have any draft picks. We had a 2.34 GPA. Since then, the GPA has risen to the highest it's ever been at 3.31. Texas, of course, one of the preseason favorites for all of college football. That's a genuine rise from where things were. And they're finding guys who, one, buy into the program, are good people on and off the field, and three, are pretty darn good football players. But one of those guys that I believe encompasses all of that is certainly Arch Manning. And look, hearing from him again, a cool, calm, collected Arch is kind of the way I would describe it. These bright lights at the media don't seem to faze him. He kind of even plays into it at times. Got a great sense of humor about him. But this is something that obviously he's had a long time to prepare for. And now that it is here, it certainly feels like he's very comfortable in his skin when talking to the media, and certainly realizes the expectation that's ahead of him.
There's a ton of hype. The circus was about what I thought it would be, but I don't think there's ever been anybody that's been as prepared to handle this as Arch has. And Arch is – I love it because Arch has mastered the art. And CJ, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. He's mastered the art of giving you a very thoughtful answer to your question without giving away any proprietary information. Like, you feel like you really got something, but when you start to break it down, you're like, all right, he's still keeping what needs to stay in-house. He's not giving away any trade secrets. And it would be really easy for him to be, disrespectful and dismiss people and look annoyed. Man, that's the furthest thing from Arch Manning. And, like his interactions with the young man that we met on the way in yesterday, the kid that was here since like 7 in the morning before everything started, finally got his picture with Arch, and Arch was great there. Like, I can't state it enough, CJ. Like, that's just who Arch Manning is. Like, you talk to enough people that are around him, and whether it's his teammates, people in the building, like that's just Arch is just a regular guy, and it's crazy because of as much attention as he gets. You wouldn't think that, but the fact that he's a regular guy. But to me, the definitive kind of Arch comment was Michael Taft was asked about competitors on the team and hard workers, and he pointed across the room and pointed at Arch and said, "Hey, the hardest working guy, the biggest competitor on offense is that guy right over there." And I think when you break it down to its core, man, Arch Manning is just a college kid that just wants to play football, and he's waited for his opportunity. It's here now, and I think he's going to relish it. This is all part of the gig, and he gets that. But, when you get him on the field, like that little swagger he showed last year, that touchdown run against Texas A&M, again, that's who Arch is. I think this is going to be a really fun, CJ, what we hope is 2 years. It's going to be a really fun 2 years with Arch at quarterback.
Yeah, he certainly played into that as well, of saying, hey, I'm here for competition. And one of the things, one last nugget on Arch is, when he was saying, I've never sat before in my life, and duh, right? He's a Manning. But those last 2 years when he was on the bench, when Quinn Ewers was the quarterback, he said, look, I would go grab anybody I could to go pick up basketball. And I would call my mom to tell her how I did in those games, because that was just competitiveness and me wanting to see some action elsewhere. I thought it was a cool little tidbit for Arch, because, of course, we're excited to see him on the football field as the guy, but for him, returning to be the guy is something I think he's certainly excited for. But that does it for our conversations about Arch and Sark. Now let's talk about future Longhorns. But before I get there, a quick word about our sponsor, Adam Lowy and the Lowy Law Firm. Adam Lowy of the Lowy Law Firm specializes in results for his clients, much like Steve Sarkisian in the 2026 recruiting cycle. Whether it's a tragic car wreck, an accident in the workplace, or any sort of serious catastrophic injury, Adam is who you want to call. So call Adam today at 512-280-0800 or reach him online at loweylawfirm.com for a free consultation. And remember, Adam Lowy focuses on results. Texas is focusing on results in recruiting as well. Look, it's been a bumpy ride. There's no way to hide that, but I was told a few times Texas is focusing on this month of July going into the season. They're focusing, obviously, on their play in the season, but they want to get the core of the group done. And look, I think Bobby Burton might have passed out if he had to say it one more time, but Texas should get to 20 or 21 recruits by the end of July. Look at where they sit currently after the additions of Tyler Atkinson, after the addition of James Johnson. Matthew, thank you very much for the graphic there. Sitting at 20 is where you want, especially with a big decision coming up this weekend from perhaps the number one running back in all of the country, Derek Cooper, in which we feel like the Texas Longhorns are in a position to be out front for that one as well going into it. But, Jeff, following all the hoopla from yesterday with Sark and the Longhorns speaking at media days, Sark came in to Atlanta, Georgia, and left with a total heist. A commitment from Georgia flipped to Texas, and the top linebacker in the state of Georgia commits to the Texas Longhorns. What were your initial takeaways, and is this the plan that Texas fans should just come to expect in recruiting over the next however many years Sark is at the helm?
The best thing I can say I can say a lot of things about Sark and the organization at Texas right now. But one of the best things I can say about them, CJ, they don't flinch. They don't panic. Like, they understand, look, you get into these, and we talked about this a lot, and I think this is bearing itself out now. You get into these high stakes battles for big time recruits, you're going to win your share, but you better be prepared to lose your share. But in the share that you lose, you got to make the decision: do we continue to go after this guy? Is this a guy that we feel not only can help us win a national championship, but is he a fit? Because hearing Sark talk so much about culture and the players, like you hear Ant Hill and Michael Taft and Arch, the way they talk, the way they carry themselves, the way they talk about their teammates and talk about people in the building and talk about this team. The culture is so valuable right now at Texas that risking it by bringing in guys that might nibble at the fabric of that culture is not worth it. So You're going after elite players, but they're elite players that you feel like fit your program. You got to continue on those guys. And I think, CJ, part of it is strategy too. Look, there have been NIL dollars that were allocated to part of your salary cap. Like, we're calling it what it is now. It's part of your cap. Part of that was allocated to Felix Ojo. Some of that was allocated to Jamarian Carlton. Well, when you lose some of these battles, and you got some of those funds available, now you can redistribute them. So if you're sticking on a James Johnson, if you're in for a Tyler Atkinson, now maybe you've got a little more ammo to go get those guys. And maybe whether it was money that didn't put you over the top when they made the initial decision, and now you're able to do it. Whatever the case is, I just like the fact that you've got a staff that's willing to be in the fight and doesn't flinch, and they're ready for it. And we hear Sark talk about roster construction. And we heard him talk about roster construction yesterday, but just in terms of how, to allocate dollars and what the pitch is and everything else. One of the things that I've heard, whether it's walking the floor with the traditional media, the legacy media and the writers, or being in where I am right now with the electronic media, or being upstairs on Digital Drive, I think people that cover this league and cover college football, CJ, have gotten their heads wrapped around the fact that, dude, you could talk about dropping bags, and certainly Texas has money. Steve Sarkisian and Texas are not messing around. They've got what's to give when it comes to building a roster. They're going to go get the guys that they want, and they've missed out on some guys, but they've had a lot more hits than misses. And right now, you look at the way Texas is building this thing, go back and look at when Kirby Smart got to Georgia and just started stacking top 3 classes on top of each other. That's how Georgia went from a good, maybe some years great program under Mark Richt to Kirby Smart taking them to elite status. That's the same trajectory Sark has Texas on right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. Look, I'm going to butcher the name of this fight because I wasn't alive for it, but the 97 Ibuchi and Tua fight where there were 1,700 punches thrown over a 12-round boxing match, that's kind of what it's felt like over the last month and a half for Texas. Look, you take some hits, you deliver some hits, and they certainly delivered some big blows to the Georgia Bulldogs and Kirby Smart yesterday. But I do think, when you look at how Texas has landed its biggest targets, whether it's an Arch Manning, whether it's a Colin Simmons, who they had to fight tooth and nail for over in LSU, whether it's an Anthony Hill, just waiting for things to open up for their opportunity to jump into the top spot. Look, Texas capitalizes. And Sarkeesian coming into Atlanta, coming into the state of Georgia. I mentioned it yesterday on Twitter and on Texas Football, the message board. Look, if you don't think Kirby Smart's sitting there saying, when is this guy back in Atlanta? I can't wait to have a piece of it. I think you'd be absolutely mistaken. But part of it is just the game of recruiting. And, of course, the one thing that fans elsewhere won't truly comprehend or stomach, or they just won't believe fully, is when Sark stands up there on the podium at SEC Media Days and he says, yeah, we don't lead with NIL. We say, hey, that's a luxury if you come to the University of Texas. It's going to be a part of what happens here if you're a good football player. But if you're coming and looking at the University of Texas for this reason, we're probably not the school for you. He said, if that's the only reason why you're here, you're probably going to be back in the portal in about 18 months. And Texas hasn't been hit too hard by guys entering the portal, and that's because of that culture at the University of Texas. But we have seen some instances where maybe guys don't feel like they've gotten on the field early enough, or they haven't capitalized on their opportunities and they've departed elsewhere because, hey, Texas is going to reward playing and delivering those expectations. And if you're not, well, that's basically a tough pill to swallow in the world of collegiate sports, which is essentially professional. But, Jeff, if Texas is able to finish out with the Derek Cooper over the next 5-6 days, that whole kind of belief of what this class is completely flips. You got the number 1 quarterback in the country. You just added a 5-star offensive lineman not even a month ago. Samari Matthews committed from North Carolina 5 days ago, and it feels like it's been swept under the rug because of the recent recruiting success as well. And if you look at where Texas is earning its recruits, it's Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, and, of course, Texas will always have some say out in California. But they're going everywhere and anywhere to make sure that talent will keep them in the conversations with the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Ohio States of the world.
Yeah, I said this when this run, and I don't know, CJ, we've seen it change just in terms of the time of year when guys make decisions. There used to be kind of that run right before football season started. Now it seems like right around the 4th of July, late June and early to mid July is when guys want to make their decisions. And one thing that I was fascinated to see how it played out, and I'm not saying I'm right or wrong, but I think this has been a factor. How was July, the entire month being a dead period? How was that going to play into things? And I think for Sark and Brandon Harris and everybody in that organization, I think it was taking these decisions and processing them. And even if you lose out on a recruitment, even if it's a recruit that you really like, now you've got time to reset and think, okay, is this a guy that we still want to pursue? And if we want to pursue him, let's make sure we've got the funds necessary to go do that. Because again, let's not sugarcoat anything. NIL and the bag is a really big part of this. But again, it also lets you say, you know what? We missed out on Felix Ojo. We missed out on Jamarian Carlton, or just go down the list of guys that Texas missed out on. Xavier Crowell. Now you can take some of that money and say, you know what? Well, let's go all in on a Derek Cooper. Let's go all in on a Tyler Atkinson. Let's go back. Let's crank up the heat for James Johnson. And again, it speaks to a staff that has a plan and doesn't panic. And I know building a college roster and building a roster in the National Football League are two very different things. But if you look at the best organizations, CJ, in the NFL, especially when it comes to the draft, you think of the Ravens, the Packers do this. The Steelers are another one that does like this. What do? They stay true to their board, right? They don't just draft for need. They stay true to they evaluate and decide, no, this is the guy that we feel like can help our organization. And again, it's different in college, but I think this is Sark and Company. It's the James Johnson recruitment is a perfect example. No, we're going to stay true to our board. We feel this guy is one of, if not the best interior defensive lineman in the country. We're going to go turn up the heat because we think if we get him, this could be the difference. He could be the difference between us being a 10-win team and maybe us beating Georgia and getting to an SEC championship game. I think that's how Sark and Company look at it. Sark didn't really get into that deep yesterday, didn't get that granular with it. But I think that's how they look at it, CJ. It's staying true to your board and, again, doing whatever it takes within the confines of the current system to get the guys that you feel can not only put you over the top, but if Sark is recruiting these guys really hard, you trust that as much as you can research it and put resources into finding out, they're the kind of character guys that have the kind of personal character and football character that are going to add to the culture, not detract from it.
The big thing you mentioned earlier is how Kirby Smart got over that hump with stacking top classes on top of top three classes on top of top three classes. Texas a year ago, the number one class in the country. Following yesterday, a big move into the top 10, firmly sitting at number 6 in the country. And again, should Texas end up on top for Derek Cooper, you're now looking at a top 5 class in which Texas fans, some of them, and I know a lot of them on the board were saying, hey, you almost be new to what Texas does in the summer. But they're going to be looking at what was maybe some panic in early July and what will be a top 5 class perhaps entering August. That's just how quickly things flip. All in all, it puts you in that position to end up with another top 3 to top 5 class, something that Texas and Steve Sarkisian have certainly been very familiar with over the last few years. Jeff, just one more time before we get out of here. Finishing with a top 3 to 5 class, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but is that the expectation this year, given where this group of prospects is currently in the class?
I think that's Sark's expectation. I think that's where they expect to be in recruiting. Look, I think one of the reasons, and this is just my opinion, CJ, I haven't researched this out or anything, and I'm not telling Texas fans I've got the answers, but I'm trying to see it through, the eyes of the masses. And I think when the panic sets in, it's because for so long, whether it was the late tenure of Mac Brown or Charlie Strong or Tom Herman, Texas fans got used to seeing their coaches either be incredibly too reactive to what's going on in recruiting or be really impatient and make bad decisions that hurt the program. And I think that's where Sark is different in terms of they've got a plan. They're willing to see the plan through. It's no different. How he recruits is no different than how he's built this program. Like, he had a plan, he had a vision, and yes, 2021 was awful. Like, we all lived it, right? We lived like the loss to Kansas and, that forgettable Iowa State game and everything else that went with it, all the blown second half leads. But Sark had a vision. I think that goes back to what he's talking about. Pete Carroll told him, which is, yeah, you just keep doing what they've been doing and, be fine getting the same results. Or you can do it your way and see if you can change things. And Sark's done it his way. That's how he's handled it in recruiting. So I just think from that standpoint, I just think Texas fans at this point should just trust Sark that he knows what he's doing. And I'll say this, CJ, if you get Derek Cooper and it cut, like we all talk about, it's a long time till December. Yeah, that cuts both ways, but I think Sark knows that they're going to continue to recruit the guys that are in their class like they're uncommitted, and hopefully you can hang on to these guys. But now, if you get Derek Cooper, now you can really hone in on, do you want to go try to flip Malachi Lee from Michigan? Do you want to really, really crank up the heat on a Jalen Lott and give him a lot to think about? So now that you're getting into the 2021, those low 20 numbers in terms of your recruiting class, you're down to those handful of select recruitments where you can really, really dig in and work really hard to try to flip some guys that you really like.
Yeah, Malachi Lee, Jalen Lott, two guys that they will certainly continue to recruit all the way through the whistle. Mark that off the bingo sheet of recruiting terminology. But on top of that, look, I know Zayden Crimpen's had some noise. Haven't yet heard a whole lot there in terms of Texas. The one that I have heard more buzz of recently has been Jake Cruel out of IMG. Does that mean Texas is going to land him immediately? No. And does that mean Texas will take him? We'll have to wait and see. Of course, he is a bit of a tweener, a little bit on the smaller end of his frame in comparison to what Texas has recruited recently at the edge spot. But there has been more noise. And as we've talked about, recruiting certainly has momentum in Texas right now. Full steam of momentum ahead. But that does it for this week's edition of State of the Program. Jeff, thank you very much for the time. Matthew, to my left, thank you very much for all the work that you do.
Real quick on that. Let me just say this, CJ, before we leave. Producer Matthew, he's been the MVP of the OTF crew in Atlanta. No, I'm not joking. Like, Matthew's been awesome. So I know everybody doesn't see him. He's behind the scenes, but trust me, man, he's making the whole thing go right now. So shout out to him.
Yeah, I know he's getting about 30 minutes of sleep per night. So thank you, Matthew, once again. And, of course, to our good friend who allowed this weekend 2 SEC Media Days possible, Von Lane, Flat Creek Estate Winery, Advanced Pain Care, South Point Dodge. Thank you very much. And to our sponsor of State of the Program, Adam Lowy and the Lowy Law Firm. Thank you for sponsoring this week's edition once again. But, Jeff, let's get back to the floor at SEC Media Days. Let's go have another couple 2 days of content. Let's do it. Okay.
Yes, sir. Welcome.